Pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Manas Panigrahi, who is a well-known figure in the field of neurosurgery in this country and abroad. Manas is currently the senior consultant neurosurgeon at KIMS Hospital in Secunderabad. His career, of course, spans with his work in clinical practice in the National Institute, in a well-known National Institute. He has been training and teaching students. He has been into clinical research. He has supervised more than 30 postgraduates for higher qualification. And alongside, he has not been lagging behind in his publications in the field of literature in neurosciences. He has published more than 100 indexed and peer-reviewed articles. And of course, he has written chapters in textbook. And everybody knows that he is a prolific neurosurgeon and always innovative in his techniques with newer ideas. And one of the interesting things which is very important is that he would try to make innovative techniques which are simple enough and they're affordable and they also help in reducing complications. So always there is an innovative thinking in his mind about all the procedures that he does. At the same time, he also comes from a background where he has received several awards. He has the Young Neurosurgeon Awards at Kyoto, Japan, International Pediatric Neurosurgeons Award at Salt Lake, USA. He has numerous traveling awards from the ISPN Congress in Rome and Australia. And he was also awarded by the Japanese Society of Infantile Seizures. So I won't come in the way between Dr. Manas and the rest of the audience. I would now request Dr. Manas Panigrahi, please, to take over the screen and give his address.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor Pathak, for a lengthy introduction. I'd like to thank Professor Pathak and Professor Shankla for giving an opportunity to speak in this the second international webinar. This concept is quite good and keeps us active in spite of the inertia of COVID. Good evening, Dr. Venkatramana, Dr. Hemant, and Dr. Ari, and Dr. Lelvin. My talk was on suprasellar arachnoid cyst. But then I have included the cyst of the lateral ventricle and quadrigeminal, and I saw that a lot of discussion on the confusion between the quadrigeminal and the lateral ventricle arachnoid cyst. So I think it will help in deciding. Means it probably will be helpful for all of you. That's why I didn't comment anything. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'll not be speaking on supratentorial arachnoid cyst. Though Dr. Lelvin has told about infratentorial, I'll just confine part of the supratentorial arachnoid cyst. The first few slides are similar, so I'll just rapidly go through. Arachnoid cysts, they are benign, non-neoplastic extra-axial cysts. They have fluid which is similar to cerebrospinal fluid, and 80% of the time they're discovered in children. They develop at the 15 weeks of gestation. So that is why most of the arachnoid cyst, as Dr. Lelvin was telling, is detected intra-utero, and if they have associated hydrocephalus, they can be treated intra-uteral or the early neonatal period. So primarily, the arachnoid cysts are congenital cysts, but sometimes we can have secondary arachnoid cysts. They are either the result of meningitis, trauma, or hemorrhage, or because of previous surgery in a cyst. What we'll be discussing today is about the primary or the congenital arachnoid cyst. An arachnoid cyst is different from an arachnoidal cistern. As Dr. Lelvin explained, that arachnoid cistern has a delicate, flimsy, translucent membrane, and they have cobweb tuberculations within it. Whereas an arachnoid cyst has a thick wall of a collagen, and it is the thick wall splits into two to to enclose fluid like CSF-like fluid to form an arachnoid cyst, and they do not have any trabeculations inside. And sometimes the wall of the cyst are lined by mesenchymal cells which can secrete, and that may be one reason for increase in the size of the arachnoid cyst. The commonest site of supratentorial arachnoid cyst is the sylvian or middle fossa, and the next common is posterior fossa. And in suprasellar and quadrigemellar and lateral ventricle, you have almost 10% frequency in each. I'll be talking about suprasellar and the lateral ventricle. Now, what's the natural history of arachnoid cyst? If you know the natural history, we know that all of them do not need treatment, as a few of them only enlarge, the cyst enlarges, and even if the cyst enlarges, some of them become symptomatic, as Dr. Ari was explaining, that the cyst, there's radiological cyst enlargement, but clinically there is no change. So symptomatic only, even if there's 10% enlargement of the cyst over a period of time, only 1/4 of them will become symptomatic. That is why we have a lot of confusion and a lot of difference of opinion when patients go from center to center about the decision of surgery. Now, the enlargement of cyst has been, the natural history has been given as different by different authors. Like Dr. Al-Holu has told that the chance of cyst enlargement is 10%, whereas the other paper, they have told it is 0.7% only. But then what has to be remembered, that the chances of symptomatic at follow-up is almost 1 to 3%, and the chances of cyst enlargement is almost ranges from 1 to 10%. Now, what are the predictors of surgery, and or which are the cysts when you see a first scan that they are likely to increase or they need treatment? So if a person comes with the age of less than 4 years, they have a higher chance of, or less than 2 years, they have a higher chance of progressive increase in size. Adults usually don't increase in size, so we do not have to keep on repeatedly doing an MRI to document increase in size and treatment. Whereas children, one has to be careful. The other is location of cyst. If it's a suprasellar or intraventricular or in the quadrigeminal, these three areas have a higher tendency to increase in size, or any minor change in size, they can cause hydrocephalus. So they become symptomatic. So if these two factors are there, then one has to follow them clinically, even if they are detected incidentally. I'll give an example of a case which I had operated a few months ago. Here, this is a suprasellar arachnoid cyst with ventriculomegaly. And one can see here that the basilar artery is in the center of the cyst. It is not draping on the brain. Now, I'll explain the significance of it in my later slides. So we did a standard frontal burr hole. We identified the foramen of Monro, and then identify the floor of the third ventricle, and then did a cystoventriculostomy. That is the first step. But then, is it enough, cystoventriculostomy? The cystoventriculostomy, now this can be done on that day. The laser didn't work, so I had to use a Fogarty. But laser is whenever there's a thick membrane, laser is very comfortable because it doesn't cause any, you don't have to manipulate the floor of the third ventricle. Once the cyst, once you have done the communication of the cystoventriculostomy, the second step is to inspect the cyst and do a cystocernostomy. So after the cystoventriculostomy is done, you enter the cyst, and here you can see the ventricle floor of the third, and the vessels are seen. There is another second membrane where one has to make the cystocernostomy. So this is the picture of the video of the cystocernostomy. One can see here that the basilar, top of basilar is in the center of the cyst, and there's a thin membrane draping on it, which has to be punctured. So cystocernostomy. So this is completion of the procedure, ventriculocystocernostomy. Now, what is enough? Is it ventriculocystostomy is enough, or one has to do a ventriculocystocernostomy? Now, this paper came in 2011, where they compared the number of they did analyze all the cases. That they took out some of the 44 cases which were reported where they had done only ventricular cystostomy, but the number of patients who required reoperation were 16%. Whereas patients who had ventricular cystocystostomy, there were 86 patients which were studied, and the reoperation rate was 8%. So this itself tells that it is always better to do a ventricular cystostomy rather than stop at ventricular cystostomy. Now, do we need to treat all supracell arachnoid cysts which come to the OPD? How do we decide that which one needs treatment? As Dr. Lilling was telling, majority of them are detected in the in vitro period, and some of them decrease in size and disappear, or majority of them decrease or disappear. But then surgery is required whenever there is an increase in size of the cyst, or when they present with a raised ICP, or they have visual disturbance. But if the patient comes with only endocrine disturbance, that's not an indication for surgery, because even if you operate patients coming with endocrine disturbance with a supracell arachnoid cyst, post-operatively, they have not shown any better outcome. So surgery is done only if there is a raised ICP, visual disturbance, or if you document that the size of the cyst increases over a period of time. Now, why do the cysts increase in size? They increase because there may be a fluid secretion by the cyst wall. They are all theories, they are not confirmed. Or there can be a one-way valve mechanism around the basilar artery, as with CSA pulsation that there is entry into the cavity, or there can be diffusion gradient between the fluid of the cavia of the cyst as well as the CSF. Now, this diffusion also can increase in size. Now, but how do we predict that which is a arachnoid cyst which is likely to increase in size, to decide that this patient needs treatment or needs a close follow-up? Because we know that the cyst size increases probably by a ball-valve mechanism, and if we can demonstrate that it's communicating type, then we can suggest surgery in early phase. Now, earlier people used to did cystonogram, and then there was immediate filling of the arachnoid cyst that was classified as communicating. In some patients there was delayed filling, and some patients it never filled. So they classified the arachnoid cyst into 3 types, and this communicating type have this communicating and immediate filling and delayed filling, because of continuous pulsation, they have a chances to increase in size. But a non-communicating type, if the absence of raised ICP, probably they will not increase in size. So if you have this kind of, if you know what is a communicating or non-communicating, probably you can make a decision that to treat or not, early or not. Now, people have done studies with intrathecal metrizamide scan to decide whether it's a communicating and non-communicating, and to decide the management. And many times they have avoided surgery also. But the previous to paper I quoted was an invasive way of documenting, which is a communicating and non-communicating. And this paper came in 2015 of predicting the way to, in non-invasive way with an MRI with cystonogram, how to with MR cystonogram, how to predict a communicating and non-communicating. Now, as all of us know, that the Liljeqvist membrane has 2 leaves. One is a diencephalic leaf, one is a mesencephalic leaf. Now, the diencephalic leaf can split into a cyst and form an arachnoid cyst, or you can have a cyst formation or fluid collection between the diencephalic membrane and the mesencephalic membrane. So there are basically 2 types of cyst. One is a splitting of the diencephalic membrane, that is type 1, or the second type is between the diencephalic membrane and the mesencephalic membrane. Or so the second type always communicates with the subarachnoid space. There's a type 1 which is just splitting of the diencephalic, that does not communicate with the diencephalic with the subarachnoid space. So in the type 1, because it's a splitting of the arachnoid cyst, it pushes the vertebral artery behind. So the basilar artery behind, so the basilar artery will be draping on the midbrain. Whereas in type 2, where it's a dilatation, it's an expansion between the diencephalic and mesencephalic, the tip of basilar artery will be freely lying inside the cyst. So the video which I showed, that was a type 2, and so we had to do a third ventriculostomy with, and again, cystoventriculostomy and a cystonostomy. So in that paper, they described that in addition to type 1 and type 2, there is a third type of subarachnoid suprasellar arachnoid cyst. That is, if the cyst enlarges or extends laterally into the medial cranial fossa. But so what is the surgical strategy if we know? If it's a type 1, then because there is a communication, there is need, and if the patient has hydrocephalus type 1, it will not increase in size. But if it's asymptomatic, you can follow up, do not do anything. But if it's symptomatic, one has to treat. So if it's asymptomatic, one need not treat, and many of the time they'll remain like that for the lifetime. But type 2 and type 3 who are communicating with CSF, if they are asymptomatic, they should be observed because the size can increase or decrease depending on the movement of the CSF fluid. Whereas if they become symptomatic, they should be treated. So this is what the example had shown. This is a type 2 cyst. Patient came with hydrocephalus, so we had done surgery. Now this is the type 1. This is a type 1 case. This can see here. This is the MRI. This is a suprasellar arachnoid cyst. We had done an MRI angio and then integrated. You can see here that the artery is draping on the midbrain. So, but again, this patient had come with symptomatic symptoms, so we had to do a surgery. But it's a splitting of the diencephalic membrane. You can see here is a very thick membrane, difficult to puncture. So one has to, after puncturing the cyst, one has to dissect all around so that the aqueduct should be free. Many times it's adherent. One has to free the aqueduct. Just checking that the aqueduct, there is no aqueductal stenosis. And after that, one has to enter the cyst and do a cystonostomy as I had shown in the previous video. So what do you do if the treatment options, if endoscope is not available? It's all historical, but then in our country, there are many centers where sometimes endoscope doesn't work or endoscope is not available. What can be done? Now one can do a craniotomy and cyst excision through a TVNL approach, or one can do a shunt of the cyst and the ventricle, or people used to do earlier percutaneous ventricular cystostomy. But if one looks at this paper, they analyzed, compared all the 4 methods, the best result for this endoscopy, the improvement of the 90%, whereas in craniotomy excision was 80% and worsening rate was 20%. In only shunt, it is 85%. Percutaneous ventricular cystostomy is 80%. So if you have endoscope, the endoscope is the best treatment for suprasellar arachnoid cyst. Having told, let me tell about something about the arachnoid cyst of the lateral ventricle. This is a 12-year-old female who came with blurring of vision for 1 month, and these are the images. Yes, she had a large cyst in the lateral ventricle. The opposite ventricle had almost, the septum pellucidum was pushed, and the opposite ventricle was small. So what we planned was to do a septostomy to communicate, because we are not sure whether we can communicate with the foramen of Monro. So we planned for a septostomy and then cystoventriculostomy on the ipsilateral side. So the first step after entering the cyst, we did a septostomy. This is what we are using a laser. And make multiple perforations, and then finally enlarge the perforation with a Fogarty catheter to complete the septostomy. And the end, you go across the ventricle to explore the opposite ventricle. The next step is communicating the cyst to the ipsilateral ventricle. And the best way to do is identify choroid plexus and coagulate and make an incision along the choroid plexus. So that's the confirmation that the cyst is communicated with the ipsilateral ventricle. So we had communicated the cyst to the ipsilateral ventricle and communicated to the opposite ventricle, so that through the foramen of Monro of the opposite side it can drain. Now this was another patient who came with headache of 6 months. Then he had a cyst in the atrium and the lateral ventricle. Now one can see here that this is communicating with the vellum interposition system, as you can see here both the internal cerebral veins. Now here again we did a cystoventriculostomy with the ipsilateral ventricle, and then identify the choroid plexus through the cyst to communicate to the interpositum system. And once that is done, the cyst, again, as I was explaining, is peeled from the wall slowly if it comes out, but if it bleeds, one should not do. And so that it collapses into a small cyst, so that the chances of recurrence of cyst is less. This is the peeling of from the walls of the ventricle. And at the end, we look for here again the same principle: identify the choroid plexus and incise the arachnoid along the choroid plexus, so that probably you can communicate with the interpositum system. This is what communicating with the interpositum system. And this is the post-op scan. The cyst has collapsed and patient is clinically better. Now you have similar patients like this patient who had the confusion to do it through a supratentorial or infratentorial. Is it a cistern of the quadrigeminal cistern, or is it lateral ventricle arachnoid cyst arising from the interpositum cistern? Again, this another case extending into the quadrigeminal cistern here, whether one has to do to the supracerebellar infratentorial wave endoscopic assisted, or do through the ventricle. As Dr. Depujari was telling, is it easier to do through the ventricle because it bulges into the lateral ventricle here, one can see here. Or this case. Now this case again is a quadrigeminal cistern who came with behavioral disturbance and a memory impairment. But one striking thing was that the vein of Galen, the deep venous system, is shifted superiorly here. So by definition, this is the only cistern which is quadrigeminal cistern, but in the previous cases, the veins are, let me show you the relevant, the veins are pushed inferiorly. So these are not quadrigeminal, by definition not quadrigeminal cistern, they are extension of the posterior interpositum cistern. So whenever there is the diagnosis is an interpositum cistern or the vein is displaced inferiorly, it is better to do through the lateral ventricle. But in a case like this, where the vein is pushed superiorly, probably doing through the infratentorial supracerebellar and endoscopic assisted is a better approach. As when you do through the lateral ventricle or through the third ventricle, we might encounter veins, and because this was the mistake we had done, I had to do a cystoventriculostomy through a very narrow space, and I was very afraid to do that. So this interventricular arachnoid cyst in the body of lateral ventricle has been classified, as I explained you, because most of them origin from the interpositum cistern, and it can extend into the lateral ventricle or superiorly into the septum pellucidum cistern. And so it is easier to operate through the lateral ventricle. So, and in that paper, they have classified that it's depending on the vein. If the internal cerebral vein and the vein of Galen is identified, if the cyst is above that, it's a vellum interpositum cistern, and if it's below that, it's a quadrigeminal cistern, So probably it is better to go posteriorly. But if it's a velum interposition cistern or in the lateral ventricle, then it's better to go to the lateral ventricle. In conclusion, arachnoid cysts are benign lesions. Only symptomatic cyst needs to be treated. Only 10% of the arachnoid cysts needs surgery. Proper interpretation of MRI is essential to classify and plan treatment. Thank you for your attention. Hello.
Thank
Ashish?
Manas is a very nice presentation, especially very good images to describe the understanding of the pathophysiology, MRIs. In the, this type 2 variety of supracellular cyst you described,
Yes.
you don't need to communicate with the cistern, just the ventricular cisternostomy is sufficient.
No, sir. Means in all the types you need to communicate.
Yeah.
It is only a question, but in a type 1, the second membrane will be very thick because it's a splitting. Whereas in type 2, because it's the mesencephalic membrane, it is thin. It's easier to do.
Okay. So it's only a technical point, but otherwise.
No. But type 2 means type 2, they have it, either they can spontaneously involute or they can increase in size because it is in communication with the CSF space. Whereas type 1, they will remain static, and but if they become symptomatic, they have to be treated off.
So what do you do when the cyst recurs after some years?
Manas?
Hello?
Disconnected?
Yeah, I think you went offline. Looks like.
Anyway, Dr. Bhartiya, you have any thoughts about
about the same thing what Venkataraman.
Yeah, Venkat.
That both in both the cases, type 1 and type 2 of the cyst, whether it is communicating or non-communicating, the better is to do a VCC, ventricular cisternostomy, because otherwise what may happen that because of the large supracellular cyst, the third ventricular wall is stretched, and once decompression is done, in most of the cases this wall will obliterate this cystoventriculostomy. So if you have a cystocysternostomy also, then it will continue to drain. Another point is the association of the aqueductal stenosis because of the long standing pressure. There may be inflammation and the aqueductal stenosis. So then in that case also, if you have done a cisternostomy, the CSF will continue to egress and the pathway may not be blocked. So these two advantages are there of doing a ventricular cisternostomy. Another point is with Dr. Manas' presentation, and as we know that either they may be symptomatic or asymptomatic. The asymptomatic patients may present with even with the endocrinopathy and also with gaze palsy. These two do not make an indication of surgery. So if it is asymptomatic with gaze palsy or endocrinopathy, you still can continue to observe the patient because these things do not usually improve following surgery. And in rest of the patients who are symptomatic with other symptoms of raised intracranial pressure, motor deficit, or other symptoms of visual acuity diminution, etc., then you need to operate.
Harry, your views on this?
Yes, a nice presentation, Dr. Manas, and can you hear me? Yeah. So, continuing comments by Dr. Bhartiya, the classification of suprasellar arachnoid cyst is to understand when to intervene and which type of arachnoid cyst can proceed to cause symptoms. That was the whole idea of the paper by André et al. Is suprasellar SAC type 1 is the bulging of the diencephalic membrane of the Liliequist membrane, whereas in SAC2, the diencephalic membrane is intact, so thereby it prevents pressure on the third ventricle, whereas the fluid is ingress into the cyst through the mesencephalic membrane defect. So they present more with hydrocephalus. My question to Dr. Manas is based on this. What would be your approach for a suprasellar arachnoid cyst without hydrocephalus, with symptoms? Or rather, what symptoms in a patient with SAC would you like to treat when hydrocephalus is not present?
Yeah, there is visual disturbance. Patient who has come with visual disturbance, but then you cannot do endoscopy. Then doing a arterional endoscopic assisted surgery and fenestration mastoblation is good. So that is the only indication in absence of hydrocephalus. But otherwise, as Dr. Bhartiya was telling, and I also quoted that endocrinopathy is not an indication of surgery in suprasellar arachnoid cyst.
Yeah, and I think
Isolated gaze palsy, like if sixth nerve palsy is there, and
Yes.
it is because of the cyst pressure, then you need not to operate. But if it is because of the hydrocephalus, then you have to operate.
Correct. Difficult to
So
differentiate.
that sixth nerve is little controversial because
Yes.
when it comes to sixth nerve, it has gone beyond the suprasellar space.
Yes.
So then there is a chances that they are ones which are progressive in size. So that comes as type 3.
I think
So
I would
that
agree
is a
with
controversy is
Yes.
there. That whether you means many people suggest surgery is better in that.
I think there is
What are the options for the recurrence of this cyst? Again, you do the just redo endoscopic procedure, or you put any devices like stent, or you think of a shunt.
Yeah, if there is a recurrence, redo endoscopy is the first option. But if the ostium is open, then shunt is the better option. Shunt is the better option. Replace a shunt. But if
there's
the
not much
ostium is closed,
You first option, you will try endoscopy and then wait. If it doesn't work, then you go for shunt.
we'll do a CSF flow study.
Yeah.
And if there is a patency, then straight away go for a shunt.
Okay.
I think there's not much debate regarding the cystostenostomy or only cystostomy, but
Yes.
a lot of cystostenostomy is definitely superior and has got better results. Your comments on actually the challenges in perforating the cyst, because that is a very practical problem when you go in and see, because the cyst will be large, flapping, sometimes maybe you will have difficulty to coagulate, and also to enter and do the second part. Like in one of your cases which you showed, all the leaflets were they're all crumbling and
Collapsed. Yeah.
collapsed together, and to reach the ETV site may be a challenging task.
Yeah. See, that's a case which I had done long ago when we did not have laser. In absence of laser, to make an opening as it means the cyst wall keeps on. You cannot perforate with your Fogarty. You have to use Caesar, and it keeps on moving. So those are the cases where laser is very helpful, so that you can make a very wide opening. And if you make a very wide opening, then it is easier to enter into the cyst and do a cystostenostomy.
Would you constrict the cyst by coagulation, progressive coagulation?
No, because I try to avoid doing coagulation because that might cause later again adhesion. So I do not do coagulation. I just separate from the ventricle as I showed, and so that it collapses, but no coagulation to shrink it.
in both the talks, we have not discussed the problem of subdural collection versus hematoma. So I would like to know the experience of both the experts, because these are known complications and they're about 10 to 15%, so they cannot be ignored. So what is the experience of both the speakers actually in terms of these two complications? They're usually treated conservatively and it subsides, but what's the experience?
Subdural is means one of the reasons of developing subdural is if one does not feel the ventricle at the end of surgery. So at the end of, to prevent that, still it happens, but to avoid that, one can fill the ventricle and plug the cortex, the whole of the cortex. Then the chances of, one can avoid the chance of developing subdural collection. But in spite of that, we have faced that, and we have done re-exploration for subdural, and there is a recollection of subdural becomes subdural hygroma. Then we have put a shunt. When I put a shunt, the hydrocephalus had increased. So for one patient, we had to do procedure for 4 or 5 times. And at the end, we had to do a shunt for the subdural space and ventriculoperitoneal space, and then he settled. So, and at least at that time, I did a literature review to find out what is the cause and how to avoid. I did not find anything much, but plugging the cortex helps in has reduced the incidence in my experience.
Is Llewellyn there with us?
Yeah, I am. So we thankfully haven't had a huge incidence of subdural collections, but every endoscopic procedure always fill up with wash after, and we use a Bicol sort of mushroom spongy stand that we use to fill the tract. So every procedure gets that. But if you have a subdural collection that's symptomatic, they can be difficult to treat. So I would make every effort to make sure that you fill the cavity with wash and plug before you flush.
The other thing I would like to ask is for the cortical cysts or the Sylvian cysts, you would prefer a dry field or a wet field, because there are added advantage of both, plus and minus points for both. So what about the two aspects of it?
For the Sylvian fissures is no, we have done wet field, but and then but we have many times we have added done a craniotomy at the junction of the cyst with the normal cortex also, so that to the basal cistern you use endoscope with a dry field to make that opening, but we communicate with the convexity cisterns also to have advantage of, it's not only communicating with the subarachnoid basal cistern, but communicating with the convexity cistern also is important. So dry field is very helpful in that case. Earlier used to do wet field, but I had problems, recurrences. But doing this combination of communicating to both basal cisterns and convexity cistern has helped.
Can I ask? There is a lot of actually challenge in diagnosing a recurrence in this cyst than the primary diagnosis. In continuation of what Dr. Venkat asked, it's easy to decide in the beginning. There's a large cyst with hydrocephalus. You go in and do endoscopic cystostomy and cysternostomy. But post-op, the image will look the same or almost same with small, probably mild reduction of the cyst. And these ventricles do not collapse when only a ETV is done as opposed to shunt. So how do you follow up these children, and how do you decide that this procedure is working or not working?
Yeah, means
These are difficult decisions to make.
yeah, suprasellar means we do regular, we do an MRI every 3 months, after 3 months and every yearly. And we have demonstrated the cyst collapse. That is why it is important in a lateral ventricle to peel off from the wall. If it's not peeled off, then it doesn't collapse. Then you have radiologically difficult, post-operatively, you have difficult to assess whether it has worked or not. And then you have to totally depend on the symptom for what you have operated. You operate for raised ICP, whether raised ICP is there or not. You cannot have a radiological follow-up. But after we started peeling off the arachnoid cyst, Even radiologically, we have demonstrated that both in suprasellar and the lateral ventricle, the cyst size reduces. And whenever at follow-up the cyst size increases, you can always take it as a recurrence.
Can I,
Yes.
in the suprasellar cyst, besides symptomatic improvement, the radiological improvement in terms of displacement of the infundibulum or the optic tract and posteriorly the mammillary bodies, and because ballooning of the floor of the third ventricle, they regress. It is not the size of the ventricles. The size of ventricle does not regress. But these things which were displaced, they definitely regress. And they are they show that your cystocystonostomy is working. So that's what is the follow-up.
I agree with you, Dr. Hemant, but it takes time. It doesn't happen immediately, and maybe about 6 months' time, about 50% of aggression, I think, Ari, we can take it as probably is successful. And, there is no real measure to say that exactly. It's a very difficult decision, actually.
In addition to, the clinical improvement.
Yeah, in addition to the clinical improvement. And I think they all need to, that's the reason I asked. 10 years later, I had the kid was doing very well, came back with recurrence of symptoms. And the second time, the displacement is not much, but I think the ostium was closed. So we need to redo that. So there was a regression, definitely. Child had endocrinopathy, which need to be treated, and later on became symptomatic once again after 10 years. So these are something that require a long-term follow-up.
Yeah, comment on coagulation. I think I invite comment on coagulating the wall versus peeling.
Coagulating wall?
Like you said, you avoid coagulation and peel
Yes.
the wall. So I would like to hear from other panelists.
I do coagulate the upper ones, like for example, the superior wall of the cyst. You can comfortably coagulate because you have the access very well. I think the only risk I feel is that if there are any underneath some veins which we do not see. So when you go down further to do the cystocystonostomy, I think there we need to be a little careful. I use only the balloon dilatation. There I would not risk to coagulate because inadvertently you might cause the problem. But I'm not sure. I mean, Manas might have experience, but I'm not sure whether will it increase definitely the fibrosis and closure. I'm not sure. So I've used the.
What I meant was in the ventricles, sir.
In the ventricles, not in the floor. Floor, nobody has.
Yeah, right.
So in the third ventricle, I have also tried to release the membrane. As Venkat said, the superficial part can be easily coagulated and cut, and the opening can be made wider. But as you go below and in the depth, it is sometimes on its own. It is so relaxed that it falls into the field, and then it is possible to do this thing. But I have never found it, to do it all around and completely. It's pretty difficult and at times risky. I don't know how Manas does it.
Even technically, he has got a laser, so that is possible. Even technically, as Manas showed in the video, the angle of working will change. The ventricular cystonostomy, the angle is different. But the cystocystonostomy, the angle is going to be different. So that is another technical problem for coagulation. But if you have the single fiber laser like that, and I'm sure it's flexible and you can take it wherever you want.
Simpler. Simple. Correct. Yeah.
There's a question from Mahesh Bhatt, Kanpur. He's asking whether there is any role of Ommaya reservoir or a CSF reservoir in cystonostomies. I believe he's talking about cystocystonostomies. So he's probably asking, I would guess that he's asking whether one would like to leave an Ommaya reservoir as a sort of another standby sort of support. In the
I would recommend not to use that because sometimes they interfere with the ostium and the primary goal of treatment itself. Secondly, the incidence of subdurals can be more when you use such Ommaya reservoirs after that. So there can be higher incidence of subdural collections. So it is being reported. So I think it's preferable not to use such devices. And if there is a failure, anyway, you need to deal with it in a different way totally.
No, reservoir we only use if there is some intra bleeding, and then you use a reservoir and then use the reservoir as an external ventricular drain. Like the MI reservoir is placed, and then later we put a scalp vein from the skin and use this as a drain. So whenever we have a intra bleeding, we use a OMI reservoir. Otherwise, routinely we do not place OMI reservoir. And the other point I want to tell about this plugging the cortex is we don't use gel foam or sponge stand. We take a small flap of the pericranium. This was published by Dr. Mohanty. While doing the burrow, we harvest a small flap of pericranium, pedicle pericranium, and take it inside and plug the cortex. And that has helped to reduce the incidence of CSF leak and subdural hematomas also.
I don't know whether, sometimes the cortex can go down because the ventricle has drained, the ventricular size has come down, it will go up and down. In that situation,
Ari also is part of that paper, I think.
No.
Ari, I would like to listen from you.
No. Sorry, I am not. I need to check.
There are some more questions.
Yeah.
I don't think there are any more questions.
There are, I can see.
Yeah.
How to plug the cortex there.
Can I ask? You showed 2 patients of trigonal arachnoid cyst for intervention.
Yes.
So, what would be your indication to to do surgery in those patients? Quadrigeminal is different. Here, trigonal, when the arachnoid cyst is present only in the trigone.
Yeah, the size
When
of
would you consider surgery?
Yeah, both the patient which I showed, they came, means one was the huge one in the lateral ventricle, it was a 12-year-old child. The other trigone was an adult patient who came with persistent headache. And we see that the size of the trigone from the contralateral side, it was almost 3 times more. And the patient, we first gave a trial of medical management of giving painkillers and all those. He continued to have headache. And so our indication is persistent headache in spite of medical management.
Yeah, I've seen a few patients where the cyst dilatation itself can cause raised ICP.
Yes.
And a second indication would be when the trigonal arachnosis is causing obstruction at the atrial level and a temporal horn loculation, which again will be an indication for definite surgery because the egress or the circulation of the CSF is blocked.
Yeah. So that again will cause headache only. I mean, they present with headache. There is one question, a lateral ventricle from where to place the burrow in lateral ventricular arachnoid cyst and role of image guidance.
Yes.
Yeah, role of image guidance means it's very helpful image guidance. But when you use image guidance, once you puncture the ventricle, the accuracy changes. So as Dr. Lalin was telling, if you have an endoscope, navigated endoscope will be very helpful when used for endoscopic procedures. The planning the burrow depends on where you want to do the fenestration. If you're making a lateral ventricular arachnoid cyst, because as I showed the case that we planned for septostomy as well as communicating with the arachnoid cyst, so we planned it in the parieto-occipital area behind. So it depends on what is the procedure you're planning, and your burrow should be contralateral to that, so that your endoscope, when you place an endoscope, you can directly see your area of interest.
I would suggest again individualization of the burrow. My idea would be to, if there is a dilated ventricle, then it is better to enter a normal ventricle and then look at the cyst, because it is always easier to puncture a convex surface than a concave surface, and it is also always easier to enter a normal anatomical cavity and then identify an abnormality than entering into a cyst. Because once you enter a cyst which has only walls and there are no anatomy to guide you, it will be difficult to identify where you're going to puncture. But in cases like one which Dr. Manas showed, where the ventricles are collapsed, you have no other option but to enter the cyst primarily and then look at the thin wall of the cyst, through which you should be able to see the ventricle, and then you can puncture. Otherwise, it's always preferable to enter an anatomical cavity and identify the convex bulge of the cyst, which can be punctured.
Yeah. Means it is the problem happens where exactly means you totally depend on the anatomy of looking at the septum. So that is the place where and looking at the area where there are no veins. But endoscopy usually helps if sometimes you can land up in making a septum going through the corpus callosum if your site of puncture is not proper. So one should avoid letting out CSF while making the puncture and keep the ventricle dilated with continuous irrigation so that the ventricle size is same as what is in the MRI. Then it helps us, then the navigation will be helpful. Or you have to make another burrow and use ultrasound and do ultrasound guided navigation.
Manas, how do you differentiate these trigonal cysts from the choroid plexus cysts?
From the MRI only. If the cyst is coming, means the margin of the cyst is near the internal cerebral vein, then it is taken as an interposition cyst, which is lateral ventricular. But if there is no, the margin is not coming near the internal cerebral vein, that has to be choroid plexus cyst.
I think that was a fantastic session, and I thank both the speakers for excellent talks. And this would bring